Location, location, location. This is a familiar cliche in the world of real estate. That is what matters. And while this may be catchy and cute, it doesn't actually quite explain the complexities of place when applied to history. The location-based environmental influences of geography and topography regularly shaped histories, just as they shape our present, in ways that we too often overlook. Welcome to Writing Westward. I'm your host, Brennan Rensink. This month we speak with historian John William Nelson about his award-winning 2023 book, Muddy Ground: Native Peoples, Chicago's Portage, and the Transformation of a Continent. Here we are reminded of how modern, industrialized, urban, and suburbanized landscapes obscure not only the historic nature of their locations, but how those previous geographic realities shaped them and their peoples. Thanks for listening. For new listeners, here's a brief introduction to the podcast and myself. Writing Westward is supported by the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University, where I, Brennan Rensink, serve as Associate Director and I'm a Professor of History. For better or worse, this podcast is a one-man operation. I'm the host, producer, sound engineer, and everything else, all roles for which I have zero training. But I am passionate about the North American West, and I'll take just about any excuse to read more books and talk to interesting people who are writing about the region. Each episode features a conversation with them, historians, journalists, novelists, poets, scientists, sociologists, and others. The goal of these exchanges is to spark your curiosity, to think more deeply about the region, its lands and environments, and the histories and experiences of the people who have called it home. If a guest intrigues you, you can find links to their work in the show notes or at writingwestward.org. And if you have a moment, please subscribe and leave reviews wherever you get your podcasts. Share links with friends. Follow us on Facebook and X or Twitter, and send in feedback. At the end of this episode, I'll include some more information about my own scholarship and about the Redd Center, our programming and projects, and funding opportunities that you could apply for. That's right, we may want to give you money. And with that, let me introduce who we are talking to this month and why. John William Nelson is Assistant Professor of History at Texas Tech University, where he teaches courses on colonial America, the American West, the Atlantic world, and Native American history. He holds a PhD in history from the University of Notre Dame. In addition to a couple book chapters in Routledge anthologies, Nelson published award-winning articles in the Michigan Historical Review in 2019 and the William & Mary Quarterly in 2021. His 2023 book that we discussed today, Muddy Ground: Native Peoples, Chicago's Portage, and the Transformation of a Continent, was published by the University of North Carolina Press in their excellent David J. Weber series in the New Borderlands History series. It won the 2024 W. Turntine Jackson Prize from the Western History Association, the 2024 Superior Achievement Award from the Illinois State Historical Society, received an honorable mention for the 2024 John Gerda Book Award from the Midwestern History Association, and was a shortlist award recipient for the 2024 Pattis Family Foundation Chicago Book Award from the Newberry Library. In Muddy Ground, Nelson offers a history of the Chicago Portage, the lowest elevation route that traverses the St. Lawrence Continental Divide, and that connects the Great Lakes to the Mississippi River drainage, and by extension, huge swaths of the North American interior. As such an important site for transportation networks, and given the fact that it became a city of overwhelming American power and influence over much of the continental interior, we might assume that it was a site of focused European colonial power as well. Not the case. Amazingly, various native peoples controlled the Chicago Portage and surrounding area for a good century and a half, blocking repeated efforts by the French and others to wrest it from them. The revelation of how this unfolded is a major contribution of Nelson's work. The other major focus of the book helps explain the why and how Native peoples controlled it for so long. Nelson grounds this history, as the title suggests, in the muddy ground of the Chicago Portage region. The nature of the place's geography, environment, ecosystems was skillfully mastered by native peoples and presented consistent obstacles to European styles of expansion and colonization. In the end, Nelson turns to the American era and demonstrates how Americans usurped native control by geoengineering that uncooperative landscape and reshaping it into one that favored their needs and their styles of development over native ones. Muddy Ground features meticulous research, clearly written prose, and draws together and makes understandable a dizzying array of sources and intersecting historical narratives. This is a book that could be used by Western historians and Westerners in general to practice thinking critically and historically about place, about the environment, and how competing peoples used them, shaped them, bent them, and how they drove histories in very unexpected ways. Professor John William Nelson, welcome to Writing Westward.
Hey, thank you, Brendan. Thanks for having me here, and looking forward to having a good conversation.
I'm really excited to talk about this book. I hope others are as well. We're going to be talking about Chicago, which some people may not think of as the West. But of course, where the West is depends on when you're talking about. I always ask my students, I like to poll them on where the West is, and their answers are always, all over the map, literally all over the map. And of course, it's like, well, where was the old Northwest Territory? Or I was like, where's Northwestern University? They're
That's
like,
right.
"Oh, isn't that in Chicago?" So yes, this is the West, especially in the time period we're going to be talking about. So your book, Muddy Ground, it is this intersection of American West, Native American history, environmental history, all kinds of other fields. And the location, Chicago, it's loomed large for a lot of Western and environmental historians for a while. I'm thinking, of my grad school experience and reading William Cronin's Nature's Metropolis, which
Exactly.
everyone had to read. Maybe
Yep.
you had to also. And that kind of presented Chicago as this key nexus or hub through which power to control vast swaths of the continent moved. But this is later in the 19th century than where you're talking about. Maybe we could start about what brought you to be thinking about earlier eras of Chicago and why it was a significant place for continental history.
Yeah. As you note, right, Chicago it's not the first place you think of when you hear the American West, the history of the American West. And yet, as historians know, this has been a kind of a focal point of how we think about Western history, going all the way back to at least Turner, right? I mean, Turner makes his frontier thesis pitch first at Chicago. And I don't think that's by accident, right? I mean, this is seen as the great city of the West in the 19th century. It's the gateway to the West in some ways. I know St. Louis claims that title now, but in the 19th century, Chicago really does loom large in the way Americans think about the West. With that being said, I didn't come to this project to write about Chicago. I actually, when I first conceived of this was my graduate, work. This was my dissertation project turned into my first book. When I came to grad school, my pitch to my advisors there was that I wanted to write a history of portage networks in the Great Lakes. And I conceived of this as very much kind of an Atlantic world, early American project when it first began. Because, back to kind of undergrad and graduate training, I came up when Atlantic history was kind of the new coin of the realm. It was having its moment, this idea of kind of waterborne networks, overlapping imperial regimes, native challenges to those regimes. But this was all happening in the Atlantic littoral. And so what I saw as a Midwestern kid who had grown up around the Great Lakes, I saw an opportunity to kind of press that story deeper into the continent and talk about these freshwater networks as both an extension of kind of an Atlantic maritime world, but also as an indigenous counter to that Atlantic maritime framework. And so that's kind of how I came at it. Is very much kind of an early American start to this. And my very wise advisor, Patrick Griffin at Notre Dame, told me, well, you can't write a history of all the portages across the Great Lakes. That will not be a doable dissertation project, and I think he was absolutely right. I'd still be
Maybe a
writing that.
doable book later on, but
Yeah, it'd be
yeah.
great, right? Write a kind of a broad synthetic history of the portage network that linked this region to an Atlantic world. That sounds great. But for a young graduate student getting started on like, where do I go? What archive do I visit? What do I even focus on? That was quite daunting, and I think would have been fairly unmanageable. So his suggestion, which I took and ran with, was why don't you find a portage that was significant to Great Lakes history and talk about all of these dynamics of waterborne movement and indigenous power and environmental change through the lens of that one specific site. Being a grad student at Notre Dame, it didn't take me long to kind of fix on Chicago as a potential place to do that from. Now, the archive is scattered, as we might get into later. There's no great repository of, Chicago portage history in Chicago itself. And so I had to go hunting, but at least I knew what I was hunting for at that point. And so Chicago did open up this potentially more expansive view of not just indigenous waterborne networks in the Great Lakes, but what they do for continental history, what they do for histories of indigenous power, change over time, environmental history, and still let me talk about this as an early American story as well, with kind of echo points to an Atlantic world. And so for that reason, it very much was a nexus point in history. It became a nexus point for me in a way to engage with all of these different historiographies.
Can you tell us a little bit about portages? Now you're using the more French or Canadian
I am, yeah.
portage pronunciation. I usually say portage, but can you explain to listeners like what a portage is? Because unless they grew up in an area with lots of lakes and were big into canoeing or kayaking, this may be a very foreign concept, and especially in the context of transportation, as most of us are. When we think of like transportation networks that empires depend on, we don't think of canoes.
Yes.
So can you explain to us what a portage actually is?
Of course, right? So this is my favorite explanation always, right? Because as you say, it's a term we see a lot in history sources, but it's not necessarily something we think about in the day to day. So a portage or a portage is what English colonists at the time referred to as a carrying place. And by carrying place, they meant carrying canoes and supplies. So a portage was anywhere that connected two bodies of water that was not navigable and therefore required you to get out of your boat, carry your canoe and your supplies across semi-dry land in most places, and then enter the next river course or the next lake or the next body of water that you're trying to get to. And so throughout native North America, these things are ubiquitous before Europeans get here as basically crossover points, kind of these, if we want to think of them almost as like a bridge between waterways, because most travel, at least in the Great Lakes region and the watery parts of the continent, was most effective via watercraft, and in most cases, that's canoes, either dugout canoes in the Mississippi drainage or further south along the coasts, or in the region that I study, the Great Lakes and what becomes Canada, birch bark canoes, which are these lighter weight craft constructed of paper birch, and so Native Americans had come up with this system from time immemorial to travel between waterways. And on a continental scale, this meant traveling between watersheds. And Chicago sits very importantly, very crucially, at one of these key divides between watersheds. So it's a continental divide at Chicago between the Great Lakes Laurentian watershed, right? If you think of the St. Lawrence River emptying out into the North Atlantic, all of the water in the Great Lakes flows that direction. But just a few miles over the Continental Divide into the Des Plaines River, which flows into the Illinois, which then flows into the Mississippi, you have one of the other major watersheds of the continent, the Mississippi drainage that flows to the Gulf of Mexico. And so from Chicago's portage, you could, within about a 4-mile carry, connect to all of the waterways in the Mississippi River drainage or all of the waterways in the Great Lakes St. Lawrence drainage. And so that was a key site long before Europeans showed up, right? Indigenous people were using this place as a convenient zone to carry canoes and to transport people, goods, etc., between two of the major watersheds of the continent.
This resonates for me with there seems to be like a real kind of explosion of indigenous maritime stuff coming out recently, and not just maritime, but also a kind of indigenous control over environments. I'm thinking of like Josh Reed's book, "The Sea Is My Country,"
Yep.
Bob Morrissey's book,
Yep.
People of the Ecotone.
Yes. Yep.
Is that what it's called?
That's it.
Yeah, or even Not With Waterways, Michelle Hoag's Métis and the Medicine Line, Whitkin's
Mhm.
Infinity of Nations and Seeing Red, Elizabeth Ellis, The Great Power of Small Nations. Like,
Yes.
your work situates within a lot of recent scholarship.
Mhm.
What unique contribution or different angles do you think that you are bringing into conversation with these other works?
Yeah, it's a great point, right? And it's kind of exciting to be in conversation with so many of these big, heavy-hitting books that have come out and are great examples of what I see as kind of a more environmentally informed story of indigenous power, right? So this is the story of native grounds and indigenous empires, if you will. But now we're telling it from a more ground up way. And so I see Muddy Ground very much situated in that kind of move. And at the same time, in conversation with, as you say, these kind of indigenous maritime history books. So Josh Reed's book, Andrew Lippman's, Saltwater Frontier, Matt Behar's Storm of the Sea. These are all about native people controlling saltwater environments and using that as both a tool of resistance, but also a tool of power in the contact zone. So in one way, Muddy Ground kind of presses that story inland to the freshwater networks of the Great Lakes. And at the same time, joins this conversation that is, again, I think, an ecologically and environmentally informed conversation about, well, okay, we know native power existed on the continent for quite some time, right? All the way into the 19th century in very kind of historically defined ways, and then more insidiously or more subversively since then. So native power doesn't go away even after so-called conquest. But during the contact and conquest eras, it's not now just a story about, well, there was indigenous power, but now it's, well, how did native people exert or use their environments to kind of hold on to that power, gain that power? The story that I tell in Muddy Ground is about kind of a resurgence of native power at the portage after the French era, right? And it's because indigenous people know how to use this space better than the Europeans that were there before tried to. And so I think that's where Muddy Ground joins the conversation, is in this melding of environmentally informed stories of these regions and the native people that were able to exert power in them.
Right now, I'm teaching a capstone seminar with environmental history as the theme, and literally just the last class we were in discussion, we were talking about how you name a topic, there is an environmental story there.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And histories of indigenous power or native, non-native conflict have been told through many lenses, right? Through trade, through economic power, political organization, alliances, all kinds of things. And you're not the first person to pivot to having the environment kind of be the foundation.
Right.
But I may have to, maybe I'll assign this episode in a week or two when it comes out to my students. Say, like, look, see, I was right. See, like, here's this great example.
It happens. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's absolutely right. I think the idea that geography can help explain indigenous power, and then the change in geography can help explain American state efforts to curb that power. That is, I think hopefully that's the novel contribution that I have to offer through the story of Chicago, because Native people hold on to Chicago much longer than other parts of the Great Lakes, specifically because of its unique kind of portage geography, right? They're able to control movement through this space. They're able to control the wetlands resources. Various European powers are not able to exert the control they want to at Chicago because of the local environment. And it's not until the U.S. state comes in and has the capacity to overhaul that geography totally, right? I
Yeah.
mean, Chicago in 1840 is almost unrecognizable to Chicago in 1820, and that's stark change.
Yeah.
And it's all bent on reshaping the landscape, reshaping the waterways. They dig a harbor. They drain the swamps, begin drainage efforts of the swamps and the wet prairies. They dig a canal that fuses these two watersheds for the first time, in a man-made effort of engineering, and all of that stuff rewrites the landscape. And as I say in the book, right, it's not just about kind of changing the rules of the game. It's about changing the board on which the game is played,
Yeah.
right? So Native people hold on to power at Chicago because of the geography, because they are exceptionally well versed in how to navigate a space like this, right? And by the 19th century, these are Anishinaabe dominated by Potawatomis. But it's not until the American state is able to kind of knock out that native geography that any meaningful successes at colonization and conquest and eventual removal happen.
I mean, this isn't the only. I mean, we've seen the United States use environmental things to control Native peoples. Like maybe
Mhm.
most obviously, eradication of the bison,
Yes.
which was
Yep.
removing a natural resource they depended on.
Yes.
But that's different than like conquest by infrastructure,
That's right.
conquest by not removing a natural resource, but by changing
Mhm.
the uh, the the physical uh, ecosystem itself, the
Yes.
geography, the topography,
Yes.
and especially for people who've been to Chicago. And I know there's like a state park or a historical
There's a
site at the
historic
port.
site at the yeah, yeah, but it's out kind of almost into the suburbs, right? Like, it's not prominent, at Chicago, and there's you know, in my interactions with Chicago public history, until very recently, Chicago was not very self-conscious about its indigenous past, right? Despite Chicago being kind of an alteration of an indigenous word, despite all of the kind of lore around, French Jesuits and French fur traders coming to Chicago to meet with Native people, and even the stuff around Fort Dearborn, and the battle that takes place in the War of 1812. There's not a lot of kind of self-consciousness of an indigenous past at Chicago. There's kind of this story, and this goes, uh, Cronin's book kind of inadvertently plays into this in a way, right? That this story is that this city rises up from the mud in the 1830s, which of course it does, but it was a historic and very crucial strategic site in the continent for centuries before that story begins. And so, I think Chicagoans, until, like I said, there's been some really good efforts in recent years at grasping at this kind of indigenous past and present in Chicago. But until then, it was very much kind of a bootstrap story of, American ingenuity at Chicago, capitalism on the rise from the 1830s on. And that's the story people think of when they think of the history of Chicago, the place. But really, as I try to show in my book, there's documented history all the way back to the 17th century, fairly unbroken documented history that we can piece together about this place. And long before that, there's obviously kind of an indigenous present um, at Chicago and in the region that makes this site significant as a place of crossover and travel and interaction.
I mean, this problem of native erasure in urban suburbanized spaces, that's nothing new, right?
Right.
Like all big American cities have an indigenous past, right?
Yes.
But this erasure is, I think, compounded in the Chicago example because a lot of that indigenous story was really grounded in the environment and the environmental kind of what the landscape looked like, and that
Yes.
landscape has also been erased
Yep.
or fully transformed. So a
Mhm.
Chicagoan is not thinking of where they live, especially like almost like downtown Chicago.
Yeah.
They're not thinking of it as a swampy wetland,
Right,
or
exactly.
they're not thinking of it as on a continental divide. I mean, this isn't the
Right.
Rocky Mountains, but it is one of, the St. Lawrence Continental Divide. It
Yes.
divides watersheds, but that's not legible
In the
on the
landscape today,
yeah,
right.
yeah.
Yeah. No,
So, like
exactly.
so say, like, in the 1670s when, when the French show up, this is Marquette
Joliet.
and Joliet, yeah. When they show up, what does this landscape look like?
Yeah. So the dominant features of this landscape, besides the riverways themselves, which are not, they're not pristine, clear water streams that we might want to picture. This is a muddy place, right? It is. The French sources describe these rivers as prairie ditches, right? That's one of the translations of how they describe it. Another one is slough, right? So picture swampy water, right? It's unclear which way the rivers are even flowing at certain parts of the year, depending on how much flood water is involved. There are the sand dunes kind of blocking the mouth of the river. But the dominant features are waterlogged prairies, so kind of low-lying areas. The Continental Divide itself is only ever like 30 feet in elevation at the most, right? And so it can flood even depending on how much snow melt there is. And so this is a sloshy, wet place. There are also oak savannas. What later pioneers will describe as oak openings. These are basically kind of, prairie ecotonal or areas where you've got a few sparse big oak trees interspersed by meadows. And so we've got, ideal grazing land for elk and deer and eventually bison by the 17th century. And a lot of wetland resources, so wild rice and large numbers of waterfowl make Chicago their home, at least as they migrate north and south, and aquatic resources. So I went out to an archaeological dig that is dated to around the kind of early decades of the 17th century, so long before the French were there. And the trash pits of this indigenous site in what is now kind of the forks of the Kankakee and Des Plaines River, they show people using lake sturgeon and turtle bones and freshwater mussels alongside the more familiar bison bones, beaver bones, that sort of stuff. And so this is a wetlands environment that people are traveling through and in some cases living in. Um, and when the Europeans arrive, it doesn't look habitable to them.
This is not the type of landscape for European style agriculture and
Absolutely not.
farming,
Yeah,
but it's a landscape that indigenous peoples had evolved to exploit quite
quite well.
effectively and to
Yes.
use.
Yes.
Does this help explain, in part, why the French are not successful in immediately setting up? I mean, they're setting up forts for fur
Hmm.
trade networks, at
Hmm.
Michilimackinac, Detroit, Niagara,
Yep.
Grand Portage. Like they know how to do this.
Yes. Yes.
Um,
They
so
don't fortify Chicago. Yeah.
why can't they do it in Chicago?
Yeah. There's a couple of factors, right? So, think of the actual landscape and then think of the political landscape.
That's the other thing I was going to say. Maybe I should actually ask this in the backwards way. So, an
Yes.
environmental obstacle, but the way to frame this in the opposite way would be: how did indigenous peoples and their actions prevent the French from controlling or building a fort here? Right. So there's the environment
Exactly.
and native peoples.
Yes, right. And so obviously the environmental kind of discouragement to French settlement at Chicago comes in the way of the actual wetlands, right? Europeans aren't keen on building forts and swamps. Um, there are, the dangers of malaria, which they don't quite understand. Miasmas, which is kind of their equivalent of that. Uh, but also just the practicality of building a fort in a waterlogged space. When Marquette tries to winter at the portage, um, he and his companions quickly realize this is dangerous because floodwaters rise overnight and they find themselves in the trees, literally, the next morning as the flood kind of hits in the spring snowmelt season. And so it's quite clear that a log cabin or a trade post or a fortification is not going to survive the seasonal flooding of Chicago at this stage. Now, there are early French boosters like Joliet, like LaSalle, who propose early on that you could dig a canal here, right? So that idea is at least in their minds as early as the late 17th century. LaSalle eventually comes to the conclusion that this would be impossible, not just because of the wetland uh, issue, but because of the sandbars that are blocking up the river mouth and these other kind of environmental factors. So that's one big um, reason why the French never, what I say, would successfully kind of colonize or fortify the portage route. The other reason, of course, is indigenous action. So this portage in the 17th century very much sits in a quite a dangerous borderland between indigenous powers. So you have the Illinois people to the south in the actual Illinois country, kind of the bottomlands towards the Mississippi.
Like long
They
grass prairie
the
kind
tall
of
grass prairie of
landscapes. Yeah.
Illinois. Yep, exactly. And this goes to Bob Morrissey's work, right? People of the Ecotone, Empire
Do you
by
want to define? Should we
Collaboration.
define ecotone really quick?
Yeah, we should. It's basically if our audience is familiar with the idea of borderlands, right? Kind of these overlapping regimes. It's a borderland for environments, right? It's the place where one major habitat structure kind of uh, bumps up against another. And so in Illinois, the ecotone of kind of the eastern woodlands bumps up against the more arid prairie that we picture. Older, geographers have referred to this as the Prairie Peninsula, but essentially, it's the border space between full-on prairie ecosystem and eastern woodland ecosystem, and so Chicago sits right in that, as do much of the river valleys and upland prairies of Illinois. So you've got the Illinois people to the south. They are growing in power throughout the 17th century, making war on neighbors in order to capture, uh, to take captives, and even participate in this kind of burgeoning indigenous slave trade in the region. To the north, you have other groups like the Anishinaabe, so that would be the Potawatomi, the Ojibwe, and the Ottawa. But also groups like the Meskwaki, what are sometimes called the
Fox.
Fox,
Yeah.
exactly, Fox Indians. And then to the east, you have the big, powerful Haudenosaunee, five nations at this point. What historians sometimes still call the Iroquois Confederacy, right? And they are launching raids as far west as Chicago in the 17th century. So because of all of these kind of uh, interregional indigenous conflicts, this undermines any kind of sense of safety or control in Chicago. Native people flee Chicago during this region or during this era because of the back and forth raiding and violence, and French people never quite get a hold on it. There's a brief period in the early 1700s when the French are able to establish a one-man post there and a brief mission, but that only lasts a few years before more threats of violence come. And the real challenge to French control in the 1700s, the 18th century, comes from the Meskwaki.
In the early half of the
That's correct.
century.
Yes, the early
Right.
half of the
Yeah.
century, after the French kind of think that they've established a regional peace, war breaks out again between France's indigenous allies in the Great Lakes and the Meskwaki people of what is now kind of Wisconsin and northern Illinois. And this is known as the Fox Wars. The French kind of get pulled into this conflict initially, but then ramp it up from about 1712 into the 1730s. But they're never able to totally conquer Meskwaki territory in Wisconsin and northern Illinois. Uh, and that includes the portage routes because the Meskwakis are
Uh-huh.
quite clever. They understand geography. They understand the necessity of the French to mobilize and use the river routes. And so, as soon as fighting breaks out in 1712, the Meskwakis intentionally begin barricading and blockading the portage routes. And this includes the Fox, Wisconsin route just to the north, but also the Chicago route. And so this, you know, what the French had hoped would be a kind of a route of trans-colonial power connecting their Illinois and Louisiana colonies with their Canadian New France, becomes instead kind of a weak spot in the French North American Empire at Chicago.
So the next like the Anishinaabe peoples, which is that there's a lot of diverse peoples kind of within that
Yes,
umbrella term.
right.
Um, what in the 1740s ish is when they kind of really
That's
start
right.
asserting a bigger presence on the scene. What is it that draws them there? This is a region of such contest and conflict.
Yes.
What draws them to the region, and what do they do differently with the French or against the
Mhm.
French than previous groups?
Yeah. Yeah. So the Anishinaabe begin moving into the region in permanent ways in the 1740s. And we should note, right, there were Potawatomi, Odawa, Ojibwe um, travelers through Chicago all the way back. As far as French sources go back, there are Anishinaabe people moving through Chicago. So it's not like they didn't know it was there, and it's not
Yeah.
like they're not around. But in the 1740s, Anishinaabe populations have actually grown. Um, they have benefited from a pretty stable relationship with the French, both economically and politically. And Anishinaabe, we see this kind of throughout the Great Lakes, begin expanding their range in the 1740s or so. So this happens, in Michael Whitkin's Infinity of Nations. In the northern Great Lakes, there are Ojibways kind of moving out into the prairies of what will become Minnesota. Um, there are Odawas, and I'm thinking of Mike McDonald's book here, Masters of Empire. Right, there are Odawas who are moving throughout the Great Lakes at this point, basically looking for new new places to hunt, new places to live, because their population is on the rise. They have formed important kin connections with other indigenous groups in the region, and so that's what brings um, Anishinaabe people to Chicago in permanent ways in the 1740s. Is they are looking for a new fur trading district, and there are still beaver to be found in the wetlands of Chicago. Not true in some other parts of the Great Lakes by that point. They also have kin connections with local Sauk and Meskwaki and Mascoutin people, right? Some of these smaller groups that have kind of held on at Chicago through the Fox Wars. And they also understand the portage geography better than the French did. Anishinaabe people had been living along key routes in the Great Lakes since before European contact, and had been exploiting these routes or using these routes to enhance their own power. So they enact tolls along the Ottawa River route of Canada. They extract tolls and sell goods to people at the Straits of Mackinac, right at Michilimackinac, at the St. Mary's River, which is what leads up into Lake Superior. So Anishinaabe people had kind of targeted portage geography for a long time as n- routes of trade, routes of mobility that they could control, and they are also some of the best so-called canoe Indians of the Great Lakes. This is how the French sources describe them, and so they're canoe mariners that can use Chicago effectively to expand into a whole new district in the Illinois country and Mississippi River Valley, um, and seek new trade opportunities there. There are accounts from the French period, of Odawa and Potawatomi traders leaving Michilimackinac, traveling through Chicago, and going all the way down to New Orleans to sell furs if they didn't like the prices in Canada, right? So these people are long distance freshwater mariners.
The scope of the mobility is really hard to kind of,
It's
and
fascinating.
especially as
Yes.
it's
It's
not
canoes.
railroads, it's not
Yes.
cars, it's not horseback, it's
Right.
canoes,
It's
right? Which is
canoes.
just, again, for people who maybe grew up in canoe country, this is not as shocking, but for a lot of people,
It
when
is.
they think
Yes.
of canoes, they think of, like, funny videos online of people tipping over and getting wet, you know?
Right. They
Um,
picture summer camp, right, where you
yeah,
like
yeah.
learn to paddle. Yeah.
So then as we move towards the end of the 18th century, though, uh, there's another new dynamic. So now we have all these Anishinaabeg peoples there, but now the British are on the scene, and there's
Yes.
now a French-British conflict
Right.
being overlaid on this same landscape. Does that change dynamics of who controls this area?
Um, Not quite, actually, at least not at first, right? So the Anishinaabe that had kind of moved in and claimed space at Chicago in the 1740s are able to use their advantageous geography to kind of fend off colonial overreach throughout the 1750s, 60s, and even 70s. Um, which means, right, they kind of keep the French alliance at arm's length, especially these Anishinaabe that have traveled to Chicago. And when the British inevitably kind of win the 7 Years' War and claim all of this interior territory for the British Empire, the Anishinaabe at Chicago uh, hold their ground, right? So there are
Literally.
literally hold their ground, right?
And they're able to because the nature of the ground is ground that Europeans haven't figured out how to hold it,
That's right.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. And so Chicago, throughout the French period, it's notable because it remains the only major portage route that is not fortified by the French, which means when the British come in to occupy French forts, there's no French fort for them to occupy at Chicago. And the Anishinaabe at Chicago are not interested in British overreach. And so they send very clear signals from 1760 on that there should be no British attempting to trade with them or come into their territory. And they kill several British traders throughout the 1760s to kind of send this message, right? Uh, do not use our route. Do not come into our sphere of influence here on the southwestern portion of Lake Michigan. And this persists even after Pontiac's War, which is the great kind of inter-indigenous uprising against the British in 1763. The Chicago holdouts, they never quite seek terms with the British, right? They will continue this kind of low level resistance, low level violence long after 1763 is over. So much so that by the 1770s, you've got British leaders like Thomas Gage and Sir William Johnson dismissing the Chicago route as not worth the trouble because these Native Americans here are not willing to cooperate. They don't want our goods. They don't seem interested in an alliance, and they keep killing our British traders that go in that direction. So pretty clearly still an indigenous ground into the Revolutionary era.
This is astounding, especially as we have a tendency to kind of read modern circumstances backward onto history is kind of inevitable, right? And we think
The
of Chicago as this just major uh, hub and where so many networks meet and this place of power. And so we assume, well, it must have always been a place of European power. I mean, that's what it
right,
became. And so
right,
clearly it must have always been a place of European power.
right.
But here
Yeah,
we have it's like 150 years post European contact
that's correct.
of this explicitly not being that. It is not what it becomes. It maybe in
Yes,
a way is that for the indigenous peoples, it's a hub for their networks of power.
exactly.
But it's surprising. It's not just 30 years. It's not just for a
Right.
season.
Yes,
150 years.
that's right.
And it's not even a single group. It's 150 years of multiple
Multiple
different indigenous
indigenous
peoples
groups.
using
Yes,
this location strategically, and Europeans just being flummoxed.
that's correct. Yeah, and what I love about the Anishinaabe story at Chicago in the 1700s is it's not just they're holding the line, so to speak, against colonization. They're actually using Chicago as kind of a bulwark to chart an upward trajectory for their people, right? So they broker several deals throughout the Revolutionary War period, in which they're getting new gifts from the Spanish in St. Louis and new trade goods from the new American revolutionaries that want access to their canoe route, and they're threatening the British as far afield as Detroit and Michilimackinac if they don't play nice with the Chicago Potawatomi. They're worried that they're going to get attacked from Chicago as kind of a launching pad of indigenous power. And so, this is very much against the the narrative of Native people losing power during the 1700s, Native people losing power after the 7 Years' War, losing power during the Revolutionary War. The Chicago Anishinaabe are on the rise throughout this period, and it's because of their geographic footing.
I remember once Colin Calloway used this example of Native peoples in colonial history, and he says, like in the documentary records, sometimes they're not visible, they're not present.
Yeah.
But he says they're kind of like a black hole, and that sometimes you can't see them.
Yes.
But you can see how they're bending.
That's
like a black hole bends.
That's a great
space
analogy.
And time.
Yes.
And I mean, if you were to map out European activities from, over this 150-year period, you would immediately notice, wait, why is there this? Why is everything bending around Chicago and nothing's happening there?
Yes.
And it's because of indigenous peoples and
that's right.
the environment.
Yes. And you describe this kind of black hole bend. We can actually see this in how Europeans map the region, right? So there's this great map. I have it in the book. It's housed in the Huntington Library of the first British mapping expedition to the Western Great Lakes. And they leave the southwest corner of Lake Michigan uncharted. So basically from Green Bay to what is now St. Joseph, Michigan on the eastern side, it's just blank space because and the map makers, right? The guys on the expedition, Thomas Hutchins, says we can't go there because the Chicago Anishinaabe won't let us. And this is just a great example of kind of this imperial eye not being able to penetrate this indigenous space, right? And that's so exciting because it gets to this feature of archival silences, right? And you ask, well, I've read, histories of the Great Lakes, the colonial Great Lakes before, and there's a lot about Detroit, there's a lot about Michilimackinac, there's a lot about Niagara. Why not so much about Chicago? It's not that Chicago is not important. It's just that there are no European officials writing from there. And so it doesn't feature in our written archive the same way these sites of French or British power factor in.
Which is probably also, I mean, I talk to my students a lot about kind of archival inertia, like the things that are deposited in archives then often determine what historians like you and me write about.
Right.
And this maybe explains why this amazing topic, you stumbled upon it and like, wait, how has no one dealt with this in a huge way? Right?
Yeah, right. Exactly. There's a very dated but very good early history of Chicago in the colonial period by a guy named Milo Quaife, right? And I should have quoted the line in the book because he writes about the early French exploration, and then his chapter between that and American arrival in the early 1800s is, he kind of sums up what happens in the Fox Wars, and he says, and the rest of Chicago is lost to history because it became, the fastness of insert, racially unsensitive words about Native people throughout the 1700s. And like, that's his like sign off about like, we don't need to talk about this
for a whole century
because we don't know what happened there because Native people were in control. Right.
Yeah. But historians like us are like, no, that's what we do need to talk about.
That's what we need to talk about. Exactly. Yeah.
And it's funny. You also mentioned like, and it's not that like they were aware, like you mentioned, I don't remember which map it was, but there's a map in which I think it's a French cartographer puts in a Fort Chicago, like
Yes, yeah,
kind of
he draws a fake
aspirationally,
fort. Yeah,
right?
yeah,
But it's not there. But they
yeah.
obviously knew they wanted it,
They
right?
wanted it to be there, right? And they've got all these,
Yeah.
like, tall-masted sailing ships throughout the Great Lakes, which, like, were not in existence in the French period. But they love this idea of kind of projecting French maritime empire into the Great Lakes, and so, draw a few fanciful maps, with forts and ships, and then, that error or that fancy gets repeated on, like, 30 different European maps throughout the 1700s. They all think there's a port at Chicago, even though no Frenchman in North America thinks that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My first publication, it was like my undergraduate kind of senior paper that I then published was about kind of aspirational cartography in a way, you
Yes.
know?
Yeah. That's
Yeah.
it. Yeah.
Um, okay, so we need to get kind of toward the end of the story. So
Sure.
the Americans, eventually show up on the scene, but
Yes.
it's not really until after the 1812 war
Mhm.
that they show up and make a concerted effort. And we already kind of hinted at this earlier.
Yes.
It's not conquest by the sword, or I guess at this point, I don't know, by the musket or the rifle.
Right.
I mean, I'm sure there's plenty of violence and things like that going
Yes.
on, but what really turns the tides is this conquest by infrastructure.
That's right. Yeah.
And you kind of you listed off a few of the types of projects. Can you give us a little bit more about what is it that Americans do in terms of building infrastructure to change the environment and geography itself that finally that is a real tipping point for against indigenous power and American ascendance, and then Chicago as we know it to be for the rest of the 19th century.
Right. Yeah. So the Americans first make claims to Chicago in the 1790s, um, at the Treaty of Greenville, and the first what I would describe as kind of the first era of American colonization efforts at Chicago look very much like the French and British ones, like very unsuccessful. They lose their whole garrison there in 1812, and so they get their nose bloodied. The Americans fail just like all other European empires have failed at Chicago up until that point. And it's not until they come back in the late 18 teens with kind of this is the era of new nationalism. This is the era of Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun promoting the idea of, at the time, what they call internal improvements, what we would call infrastructure projects or public works projects. So if you can think back to your U.S. history survey courses, right? This is the era of the Erie Canal. This is
Yeah.
the era of industrialization. This is the era in which the American state starts to invest in transportation systems that are going to supposedly rewrite the continent, unite the continent in new ways. And it starts with state capacity at places like Chicago. So the United States comes back in, and quite quickly after the War of 1812, they negotiate for a strip of land along the Chicago, Des Plaines, and Illinois rivers that they plan on building a canal at. Eventually, the federal government is going to gift this land to the kind of upstart state of Illinois after Illinois achieved statehood in 1818, and that will become the kind of the keystone project that will rewrite the landscape of Chicago, because up until that point, Anishinaabe people had been controlling the canoe route through the portage. Right, it's native people that you have to negotiate with when you're kind of crossing that space as a fur trader or a traveler. It's native headmen that you pay a toll to or give gifts of goods to along the river route. It's also indigenous porters that are the labor that help you carry your supplies and canoes across that space. And when native people want to shut down that movement, they can until this late American period. And so Americans that want to promote Chicago as an American place in the 1820s see the canal as the answer to this confounding geography. And so the canal project won't get started until the 1830s, but there's funding being laid out by the 1820s for this thing. Along with that, they've got to make the Chicago River usable for something other than a canoe. So the Chicago River at this time is notoriously malleable. The sand dunes that I mentioned earlier reshape the lakefront every year. And the ice during the winter
Mhm.
piles up and pushes the river mouth inland. And so it messes with the flows, but it also messes with the draft. If you want to think in sailing terms, right? You can't sail anything bigger than a canoe over the bar at the mouth of the Chicago River until in the late 1820s, early 1830s, Congress begins investing in what they call harbor improvements at Chicago. So they lay a set of piers. They try to reshape the mouth of the Chicago River. They essentially eventually create an artificial harbor at Chicago so that European style shipping can enter the river. Before that, European ships would have to anchor off shore and then ferry their goods one canoe load at a time into Chicago. And so that's very inefficient. No one wants to do that.
And at
Um,
certain times of year, it is not
Not
possible.
usable.
Yeah.
Exactly. Right. Depending on whether the water's too low or too high, you can't even get through there. So the harbor improvements are big. The canal project is obviously going to be kind of the final coup of victory for the Americans. But it's also small things, right? Like building bridges across the river for the first time, laying out survey plats of land for selling private property along the riverfront. And then eventually drainage projects that, they'll use tile. This is kind of getting into kind of the mid 19th century, but they will use tile. They'll bury it under the ground and they'll use that to kind of drain the lands and make it farmable.
Yeah,
And
platting it out and surveying it to sell is fine, but if it's wetland,
but if it's
it's
wetland, no one
it's not
wants
gonna
it
work.
anyway. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And so you have to make the land usable for a, white American um, uh, settler state. And that means making it arable, farmable land. It means a grid structure of housing and plats. And it means a canal that they break ground on in 1836. And I find it no coincidence, right, that this is also the year that Indian removal is forced upon the Anishinaabe of Chicago and the wider region. The Chicago Treaty kind of formalizes that in 1833, but it's not until 1836 that Native people are forced off their lands in northern Illinois and in Chicago specifically.
Because before then, Americans, but no one else had really the leverage or the power,
That's
or
right.
they hadn't decreased native control and
Yes.
power enough to. Yeah.
Hadn't undermined kind of this indigenous power in Chicago. And so once that happens in the 1830s, only then can the Americans kind of force their hand and force the Anishinaabe to kind of take the best deal they can get for the remainder of their lands in uh, northern Illinois and southern Wisconsin. And as you said, this is not explicitly conquest by the sword. Of course, there is always the great threat of violence that the American negotiators leverage, but the Anishinaabe never lose a battle to the Americans. The only times they engage during the War of 1812, they win, and so it is not by some kind of right of conquest that the Americans are able to force this to become an American space. It's because they attack the landscape.
Yeah.
And it
Conquest by shovel
conquest
or
by shovel. That's a great way of putting it.
geoengineering or
Yes.
yeah.
Yes. Yep.
Well, we're running out of time. If we
Sure.
zoom way out,
Yes. Yeah.
and think about the West more broadly,
Yes.
uh, what do you want Western, not just Western historians, people in the West who live in places that have native pasts, places that have environmental pasts that might now
Mhm.
not be legible on the land?
Yes.
Like, what lessons are exportable kind of more broadly to other places in the West that you hope people pick up on?
Yeah. Well, I think this story, it sounds like it's way back in time, right? When we're talking about the 17th century or even 1836. But this actually looks a lot more familiar when viewed in the lens of modern Western history, right? I mean, this is not that different from the Great Dam damming projects of the 20th century, right? This is not that different from the draining and irrigation uh, mess that is the Colorado River Valley now, right? And this is not that different from current drilling and mining projects that we see causing controversy throughout not just the lower 48, but also I'm thinking of Alaska, right? Bristol Bay and the Arctic Refuge. This is infrastructure, and this is infrastructure um, on the offensive against native spaces, right?
I'd be interested to put you and Cole Thrush on a panel together.
Yeah,
Him
yeah,
thinking about his native Seattle
exactly,
book,
right.
which, I mean, Seattle exists today because of, I mean, enormous
Mm-hmm.
infrastructure
That's right.
projects and kind of, you know, geographic engineering.
Rewriting that
Yeah,
whole kind of seascape, right, to
yeah.
make it into a metropolis, and so we talk about environmental justice as it relates to indigenous people in the 20th century, right? We think of the Dakota Access Pipeline and other places like that as a very real current problem of environmental injustice. This is the root of that story, right? Chicago is an early indication that this is kind of a bigger form of conquest that the U.S. settler state is going to deploy, not just at Chicago, but across the Great Lakes, across the Trans-Mississippi West, and is currently still very much active in that, right? And so you want to look for the roots of an environmental justice movement, or what I call environmental injustice. You have to look all the way back to the early republic, where public works projects are being used as a weapon of the state against native people.
Well, I'm going to propose that one of your future projects be maybe a nice anthology on, yeah, conquest by infrastructure.
Yeah, yeah,
'Cause I think, I mean, actually, now that I think about it, it was just two episodes ago, I did an episode about Los Angeles and Los Angeles
yeah.
Harbor.
Hmm.
Yeah, infrastructure history, I think, we needs to be a new, we needs a resurgent.
It does, yeah.
Well, as we wrap up, tell us about what you're working on next. What should we be watching for?
Well, I'm gonna keep putting that Portage network synthesis in the back burner for now.
That's
What
book
I
3 or 4.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's a comfortable full professor job. But the current project that I'm really excited about, really digging into now that this book is out and doing its own thing, is what I'm calling a renegade's history of the Revolutionary West. And so this is uh, again, kind of Western oriented, certainly frontier oriented, starting with the Revolutionary War and going forward at least to the era of Indian removal, um, where you have reports in these battles between the American revolutionaries and then eventually the American army of uh, white bodies littering the field after battles, right? And this
Where they're
happens
not expected.
when they're not
Like,
expected.
where
Yes,
they're expecting to see only native
that's
bodies.
correct, right?
Okay.
And so the report that really tuned me into this phenomenon, I was reading the Anthony Wayne papers because he's one of the first guys that is interested in building a U.S. fort at Chicago. But he's writing this report back from Fallen Timbers, kind of this big watershed victory for the Americans in the Ohio country in 1794. And not only are there um, white combatants among the uh, Indian Confederacy resisting him at that point, he captures several of them and interviews them to understand why they are fighting for what he sees as the wrong side, right? Like, why, as you know, and these are not just um, white people who've been taken as captives at an early age. These are people who have literally crossed over to fight alongside native resistance efforts in the Old Northwest. And so my project is to kind of compile a good handful of these people, and there are men and women in the records. And I've got it narrowed down to about 8 people that make enough of an archival footprint from Fallen Timbers onward to be able to say, well, what is motivating someone like that to challenge the racial hierarchies of the new American state in the early West? And what's really interesting is that these people who find themselves at Fallen Timbers in 1794 and survive, they go on to lead some very interesting and diverse lives after the fact. So some of them kind of reconcile with the American state and even become they enter occupations like Indian agent or interpreter for U.S. forts. Others never really reconcile. They either flee to British Canada and they're going to continue to resist American hegemony there through the War of 1812 and beyond, or in a few instances that I found, these so-called white renegades, which is what they're called in many of the sources, choose to remove with Native peoples into the Trans-Mississippi West if they make it as far as the 1820s or 30s. And that, is quite fascinating too. And so this is a early stage of the project. I see it as kind of a group biography of these people, but one that hopefully goes beyond the biographical and starts asking questions about where non-white people fit into the early American state, and where, these so-called white renegades, where they see an issue with this kind of new racial order that gets imposed from the Revolutionary War forward, and why they resist it, right? Not just in words, right? They're not just writing letters in support of indigenous friends or allies. They are, in many cases, literally taking up arms to resist American expansion, even though they, have grown up in these same frontier communities in Kentucky and Pennsylvania and Ohio, that breed so much kind of racial violence in this same period.
Well, this sounds really awesome. And one thing that really excites me about this is how it might serve to further kind of reify the contingency of historical moments, right?
Yeah.
That we read our current American conquest backwards and assume, well, that's the way it was always going to go, and it must have been obvious to people that this is the way it was going to go.
Yeah.
But this shows no, on the ground, it was not so certain, and some people actually chose the other way, and that's really interesting.
Yeah, these people are contesting the narrative that American state makers are trying to make in 1790, and they're contesting our assumptions about what we know of, the inevitability of American conquest in the 19th century.
Well, that sounds great. I hope it is quick work for you.
Thanks.
So we can see it soon. Thank you for spending time with us, John. This has been really great. Congrats on the book. Congrats on the awards.
Thanks.
And congrats on the impending rank advancement and, everything else, all the other good things going on in your life.
Yeah, well, this has been a real pleasure, Brendan. Thank you for having me. And always great to talk about, where these intersections between indigenous, early American, and Western history happen, because that's the exciting stuff.
All right, John, we'll take care.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. I hope you'll subscribe and listen every month. Please leave us a review on whatever app or platform you're listening through, and follow us on Facebook at Writing Westward Podcast or on X or Twitter at Writing West. There you can get updates and leave comments and share episodes with your friends, family, and colleagues. Writing Westward is supported by the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University. We are an interdisciplinary research center that supports academic and public research and promotion of public understanding of the North American West. We host regular public lectures, which we live stream on our YouTube and Facebook pages, have an annual funding cycle with award, grant, and fellowship categories that nearly anyone can apply for if they are researching or working on the region from any disciplinary approach or towards any final product. Learn more at reddcenter.byu.edu. That's REDD Center. Our theme music was provided by local Utah composer Micah Dahl Anderson. His website is also linked in the show notes. As you know by now, my name is Brendan Rensing, and since I serve as the podcast host, producer, sound engineer, publicist, and everything else for the podcast, you can direct praise or critique my work. As a historian, I'm the author and editor of a number of books, articles, and chapters on the North American West, borderlands, Native peoples, genocide studies, religion, the environment, and other topics. My most prominent publications include a 2018 book, Native but Foreign: Indigenous Immigrants and Refugees in North American Borderlands, which won the Best Historical Nonfiction Book Award from the Western Writers of America, a 2019 anthology I co-edited with P. Jane Hafen, Essays on American Indian and Mormon History, which won the Metcalf Best Anthology Book Prize from the John Whitmer Historical Association, and a 2022 collection of essays I edited entitled The North American West in the 21st Century. I also recently launched and will be editing a new series for the University of New Mexico Press entitled Histories of the North American West. So send me a note if you have a manuscript to propose for publication. Here at the Red Center, I'm also general editor and project manager of a great digital public history project, Intermountain Histories. It's a free mobile app and website that curates student-researched and written micro-histories of the region, complete with archival photos, bibliographies, and more. To contact me about that project, the podcast, my own research, or anything else, head to bwrensink, that's bwrensink.org. Email me at bwrensink@byu.edu, or follow me on X Twitter at Brendan W. Rensink. Until next month, be well.